Hi, everyone. My name is Mona,
And I'm Simrat.
and we're both from the Legal Education and Resource Network, which is a commission under the Office of Internal Vice President in ASUCI. And today we're going to talk about DACA. So DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it allows undocumented individuals who are brought to the U.S. as children to receive deferred action from deportation, as well as receive eligibility for work permit under a renewable program. Those protected under DACA do not have a direct path to citizenship currently, nor do they enjoy certain rights only reserved to citizens, such as voting. DACA recipients are required to pay federal income tax, but they do not qualify for certain federal benefits, such as Social Security. Additionally, DACA recipients do have access to some state benefits, such as unemployment insurance or driver's license. However, the exact details vary by state, and so each state has different ways for how they treat DACA individuals.
Okay, so some history about DACA. In 2001, the DREAM Act is introduced, but it fails to be passed by Congress. So in 2012, President Obama signs DACA as an executive order, and the requirements for applicants included them having to have arrived in the US before the age of 16, have no criminal record, and currently be below the age of 30. Since this was passed, about 790,000 young immigrants have been able to gain security and protection and the benefits we previously mentioned. However, there have been multiple attempts to block DACA and the expansion that Obama intended to implement in 2014, which was ultimately rejected by courts. And then in 2017 through 2018, the Trump administration worked to halt that expansion and any others, as well as limiting the act, which meant that individuals could not apply for DACA and they could only renew their existing DACA. However, in 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration could not rescind DACA because they did not have any proper reasoning. And then once President Biden was inaugurated, he signed an executive order to reinstate DACA on his first day in office.
So there are lots of resources available for undocumented individuals and DACA recipients. So one thing that is important to realize is that immigration agents may use your social media account against you in a deportation or criminal case, which is why it's important to protect yourself. And we have some tips that the National Immigration Project has posted. And so you can reduce your risk of that happening by not using your real name if it's not necessary, not using an email address on your social media accounts that's your main email account, also making sure that you update your privacy and security settings, being mindful of the audience of your social media platform, and reviewing your profile. Additionally, the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, has an immigrants' rights guide. So you can visit that link to find some more detailed information about what advice they have for immigrants in order to make sure that your rights are being protected. And if you're interested in some more detailed information on DACA, you can visit the USCIS page, which has some more information on DACA in detail.
Further resources, there are also cards that you can print out that have your constitutional rights written on them in case you are ever in a situation with law enforcement. The one that we have included here is provided by the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. And then UCI itself also has different organizations which can provide more resources and information, including the Dream Center, the International Center, and our own website, the Learn Resource Directory. And today we're going to be talking to Professor Golob from the Criminology Department about legal rights of undocumented residents. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Golob.
Of course, it's a pleasure to chat with you both. And of course, anyone who's living in the future viewing this video, right? Fun times related to remote learning. So I very much appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. So the first question is, what rights do you have as an undocumented resident of the US?
So that's an important starting point, of course, and I know somewhat foundationally related to a lot of what Simra and I have had the opportunity to explore in our constitutional law course. And so we really want to start at the point of remembering that this is our core crucial legal point. Being undocumented is not a crime, regardless of how you've seen it portrayed in the media, regardless of what happened with our most recent Trump administration and some of those direct attacks that we saw on immigrants, both undocumented and legal here in the US. We want to keep in mind that it's a civil violation. And so undocumented immigrants, in addition to it not being a crime, have a lot of rights under the US Constitution. And so it's very important that we keep in mind, and again, Simrat also as our expert here, feel free to jump in at any point, but I won't cold call her or put her on the spot or anything along those lines. But as she'll recall, every portion of the Constitution that we visited in our course, and that's because it's most of the provisions of the Constitution, apply on the basis of what is called like personhood in terms of jurisdiction in the US. And so if you went through and you read the number of amendments that we cover on our course, which is everything from the First Amendment to the Fourth Amendment to the Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, you would see that more often than not, the term that's used is people or person rather than citizen. And so that's very important to keep in mind, because as long as you are on US soil, that means that those provisions of the Constitution apply to you. In theory, right? Of course, they get put into practice in a number of different ways. But for example, the Fourth Amendment, which is the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, it's one we talk about a lot. I know we were just talking about the Grammys and Jay-Z and Beyonce, but we read the Fourth Amendment through Jay-Z's 99 Problems because he's being pulled over by police officers in that song. And there's actually quite a dialogue going back and forth about rights and unreasonable searches and seizures in that space. But the Fourth Amendment starts out saying the right of the people, not the right of the citizens. And so we want to keep in mind that that applies to undocumented individuals as well. So undocumented immigrants, we of course could have an entire course about this, which we often do, right? Have the right of freedom of speech and religion, the right to be treated fairly, due process rights, the right to privacy, so many other fundamental rights that US citizens enjoy.
Thank you so much for that wonderful insight. For the next question, what protections do you have if a police officer confronts you?
Wonderful. Another very important topic to be thinking about. I know often we're thinking about interaction with law enforcement in many different forms. And so we first want to make a bit of a distinction between, of course, there can be police officers and there can also be ICE agents, and have a little bit of that conversation. But the first consideration that's really important, just like our first primary consideration about being undocumented not being a crime, is that context matters. So you want to think about the space that you're in, because the protections that you have, although you always have certain blanket protections, I say always, right? We're going to get into thinking about what does it mean to have those rights on our books versus in action. But the context really matters, and an exploration we often do in constitutional law in our class, because it happens in the jurisprudence, is when the person's being confronted by the police officer, what space are they currently in? And so you want to think about for example, we mentioned the right to privacy and how undocumented immigrants still have that right to privacy just as US citizens do. That right is going to look different depending on whether you're at home, whether you're at work, whether you're out in public, whether you're in jail or police custody or in a detention center. And so the space that is often conceived of as the most private in constitutional jurisprudence, and this would make sense if I ask you all, it's like, what space do you consider most private? I say you all, I mean both Mona and Simrat, but of course any other fictional and real person watching this in the future, you would say your home, the space that you live in, right? And we could even get increasingly more private. within those spaces. So your own room or your own bathroom. But if a police officer ever comes to your home in some capacity, do not open the door, right? So we're not giving out specific legal advice, but if you combed through what all of our immigration nonprofit organizations say, what all of our legal jurisprudence says, that would always fundamentally be within your right, is to not open the door. That is your private space. And you could ask for ID. So whether you're looking through a window or some other capacity, right? So keeping in mind that officers can only enter your private home if they have either your explicit permission. So we're always in our course when we're doing this like handbook of different rights, right? We're like, don't give explicit permission, because that is often a pathway for law enforcement to do what they want. So either they need explicit permission or they need a valid warrant, which means having probable cause in order to get that warrant. And so if they don't have that, and if they don't have that warrant, they don't have your explicit permission, then they can't enter your home and then effectuate or achieve essentially whatever they're trying to achieve. That, of course, will vary with different types of spaces, right? So work, whether you work at UCI or elsewhere, right? Again, officers can only enter that workspace with either permission from the employer or, some other valid warrant that has already been determined by a judge to give them probable cause in order to enter. And so all different types of spaces, of course, if I asked you what spaces do you have less privacy in, it would make sense to say public, right? You don't have the same claims to privacy in public as you do in your own home. But still, there's best practices. I know that Simra and Mona have compiled a number of wonderful resources for you through the ACLU and elsewhere about best ways to interact. And it really tells you about like not running, but before you say anything else, asking if you're free to go, always reminding that you don't consent to the search. And so all of those rights that you have, you are able to be vocal about them and you're able to express them. And again, could look a bit different, right? So then there's the consideration, which is often the corollary question of this is, well, do I not have any protections once I'm like in jail or in custody or in a detention center? But it's important definitely to keep in mind that even if someone has committed a crime or is suspected of a crime, that doesn't mean that their rights just go out the window, right? So often our rights are activated after we've either been suspected of committing a crime or have committed a crime, right? So whether that's the right to a speedy trial or a right to a fair, impartial jury, those all don't get activated until that point in time where you've been suspected and tried for a crime. And so the police can't detain anyone who hasn't at least been suspected of a crime. And as we know, going back to our first component, right, you have not committed a crime. No one has committed a crime just by being undocumented. So, for example, if a police officer encounters someone just walking down the street who turns out to be undocumented, they can't arrest that person because that person hasn't committed a crime. Just by walking down the street and being undocumented is not a crime. I'll probably say that 200 times in this short little video, right? That's where a little bit of that distinction comes in between police officers and ICE, because ICE can arrest and detain someone for being undocumented, whereas police officers such as, UCI PD or anyone else can't, right? And so similarly though, if the police arrest someone who is undocumented, for example, let's say because they are suspected of committing a crime or for some other reason, they have to release them as soon as it's been determined that they are cleared or they've posted bail or they've served their appropriate time in jail. They can't just continue to hold someone because they are undocumented in hopes that ICE eventually shows up or is going to show up or anything along those lines.
Thank you so much. And that leads into our next question, which is what's the difference between sanctuary and non-sanctuary cities? And especially, what does that distinction mean for DACA recipients?
Wonderful. I know this has been, well, with topics of immigration in general, this has been a hot button topic and issue, especially with the Trump administration, because so many claims were made around immigration that were problematic and untrue, both in the Twitter space and elsewhere. I know Simran and Mona are also sharing with you some information about social media, which is another specialty and interest of mine. Well, not specialty in terms of my own platforms. I have like 36 followers on Instagram, but I mean, at least from a scholarship perspective, maybe 36 is a lot, right? I don't know. What moment are we currently living in? You all can let me know. I defer to you all as the social media experts, but there's of course also really clear best practices in terms of how to use social media, none of which were potentially followed by Trump. But going to the question of thinking about this sanctuary city versus non-sanctuary cities, it's been discussed a lot. And it's important to keep in mind, we often hear the terminology of sanctuary cities, and those largely refer to jurisdictions that have said they're going to limit their cooperation with federal immigration enforcement agents, right? So essentially they're saying, we're not going to cooperate with national federal immigration policy. But it's important to keep in mind when we talk about sanctuary cities that they're a bit of a misnomer on two levels. So you might see different terminology or hear different terminology, or it could even be useful to bring this into conversation with people when they're telling you about sanctuary cities or asking you. And the reason I say a misnomer on two levels is we can look at both parts of that word. For example, cities, right? So they're not always just a city. You can have a sanctuary county, you can have a sanctuary state. A great example is California, because that's where our UCI community is housed. And a lot of you have original ties to California, or perhaps from California, your family first came to California, but we all have some connection in one way or another to California. And California is what has been called a sanctuary state. And that stems from when Governor Brown actually introduced a bill to say that California as a whole would become a sanctuary state. This happened in 2017, and there were challenges. We've talked about the Trump administration. There were challenges under the Trump administration saying that California as a state as a whole shouldn't be offering those types of protections to undocumented individuals. It was actually a huge victory of sorts, even though it didn't actually become a case for California as a whole. And this decision by Governor Brown, when in 2020, the Supreme Court of the United States actually refused to hear the case from the Trump administration that was saying that California becoming a sanctuary state was problematic and needed to be struck down. And so that's one important component to keep in mind, is that they're not always just individual cities. They can be counties, they can be states. And then recall that I said that misnomer on two levels, the other aspect of that being some debate whether or not the word sanctuary is the most appropriate word, because often individuals hear sanctuary city, and that means they think that means that there's no cooperation with federal immigration enforcement agencies. But what it really means in practice is a limited form of cooperation, which means that low priority immigrants are low priority. We'll put that in quotes, right? Because that has nothing to do with them as individuals. It just means that those who are here and undocumented are protected from deportation in these spaces, but that doesn't mean that sanctuary cities or counties or states won't still turn over more serious criminal offenders who also happen to be undocumented individuals, right? So it goes back to our core point, being undocumented, not a crime. So if you're in a sanctuary city, sanctuary county, sanctuary state, they say they're not going to turn you over to federal enforcement agencies because you're low priority. But that doesn't mean that if you don't commit other crimes, they won't still cooperate with ICE and federal law enforcement agencies. So again, we could think about what those serious crimes mean. I know that we've done that to various degrees in my courses, but some immigration advocacy organizations have come to prefer the term safe cities instead of sanctuary cities, because they wanted to get a bit away from that misnomer. But whether you see safe city or whether you see sanctuary city, you now have the knowledge to know both the ways that that is accurate and inaccurate.
Great, thank you so much. So we really appreciate having you today. And if you have any further questions, for those watching, feel free to email us at legalresources@ascci.uci.edu and visit our website for more information. So thank you so much, Professor Golob.
Of course, thank you both. And similarly, everyone's always welcome to email me. I know there's always questions because we can say, for example, that ICE, for example, that jails can't detain undocumented immigrants indefinitely until ICE shows up, but that doesn't always happen in practice, right? And I know that law enforcement individuals sometimes do that, or we talked about how they should be free to go as soon as they've posted bail, but we've seen a history of them, instead of releasing them on their own recognizance, which meant they wouldn't have to post bail, or setting the bail at an appropriate amount, even for minor crimes for undocumented individuals, they'll sometimes set the bail very high. So just an important point that Simrat's probably heard way too many, and I know a lot of our scholars in the CLS space have, but we always want to be thinking about law in the books versus law in action. And so much of what I shared with you is like, this is what it says in the Constitution, right? This is what it says on the books, but we know the reality of our justice system doesn't always look like that in practice. So I know both myself and Simrat and Mona are always excited to discuss that with you in more depth. So thank you both again for the wonderful invitation, and everyone for taking the time to watch this.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for your insight. And thank you to everyone for watching the video as well.